I used to think the person who made my heart race was the one I loved, until it happened with someone else. I used to believe I had it all. A good man, a good life, and a quiet kind of love that many people spend their lives searching for. Michael was the man who knew how I liked my tea, who left me notes in the kitchen when he left early, who once stayed up all night on the bathroom floor rubbing my back when I had the flu and refused to let me feel alone. We'd been together over a decade, and he never forgot anniversaries, never raised his voice, never made me doubt him. Our life together was comfortable, peaceful, predictable. We had routines: Sunday pancakes, Friday takeout from the same Italian place, the shared toothbrush cup on the sink. It was easy to call that happiness. But peace has its price. And mine was silence. Over time, something inside me began to shift. It wasn't dramatic, just a slow, quiet ache. A fading. I stopped dreaming, stopped writing, stopped laughing the way I used to, loud and unfiltered. My world shrank down to errands, chores, and polite conversation. I didn't know what was missing. I only knew that something was. I started waking up in the middle of the night and staring at the ceiling, wondering how I got here. I wasn't unhappy, not exactly. But I wasn't alive, either. I felt like a placeholder in my own story. Then Chris came back. Michael's best friend since they were 12, Chris had been away for years, different city, different life. But once, long before Michael and I ever met, he had been more than a friend to me. Just a summer. Just a mistake. Or so I told myself. Michael never knew. And I buried it deep enough to almost believe it didn't matter. When Chris moved back to town, it seemed innocent at first. Michael was thrilled. They reconnected like nothing had changed. And suddenly, Chris was at our house for dinner, helping in the kitchen, laughing with us over old photos. I played along, smiled, pretended. But the first time I caught Chris watching me when Michael wasn't looking, I felt the world shift slightly beneath my feet. Not lust. Not even desire. Just recognition. Like someone remembering a language they used to speak fluently. I tried to ignore it, to bury it like before. But some things, once unearthed, do not go back quietly. I started noticing things. The way Chris remembered my favorite band from 15 years ago. The way he looked at me when I laughed, like it was something rare. The way my pulse changed when he was near. And Michael, kind, steady Michael, noticed nothing. Or so I thought. One rainy Friday night, Michael had to work late. Chris texted, asking if I wanted to watch an old movie we used to love. I hesitated. I should have said no. Instead, I said, just one. We didn't plan anything. There were no confessions, no forbidden touches. But when he handed me a glass of wine and our fingers brushed, something electric passed between us. I looked away too quickly. You okay? He asked softly. I nodded. Just tired. But I wasn't tired. I was terrified. After he left, I stood by the door for a long time, staring into the rain. Nothing had happened. And yet everything had changed. That night, lying beside Michael, I watched him sleep. His arm was draped across my waist, just like always. He looked peaceful. I felt like a liar. And worse, I felt like I didn't belong in my own skin anymore. The days that followed were thick with tension I couldn't name out loud. I went through the motions, grocery shopping, replying to emails, cooking dinner. But beneath the surface, something was humming inside me like a song I didn't want to admit I remembered. Chris didn't text. I didn't reach out. But the silence between us wasn't empty. It was filled with what we didn't say that night, what neither of us dared admit. Michael, as always, remained kind. But I started noticing the way his eyes lingered when I moved past him. How his questions came just a bit too softly, like someone tiptoeing through a room they used to own. You okay? He asked one evening as we folded laundry side by side. You've seemed elsewhere. I smiled. Too fast. Just tired. That word again. The lie I kept using to cover everything else. Later that night, as I lay beside him, I remembered our wedding night. Not the ceremony, but after. The way he pulled me close, as if the world might try to steal me away. How he whispered that I was the safest place he'd ever known. I had believed him. I had been that place once.
But now?
Now I was something else. A woman standing between two versions of herself, one clinging to comfort, the other aching for something nameless. Chris showed up again the next Friday. Michael was at a company retreat. I hadn't invited Chris, but he knocked anyway, holding a bottle of wine and a hesitant look. "I know I shouldn't," he said. I opened the door anyway. We sat in the living room, the lights low, the candle flickering between us. We didn't say much.
But
everything was in the silences. At one point he asked, "Do you ever wonder if we got it wrong? Back then?" I looked at him.
no.
"I think we got it right. We just weren't ready. And now, I'm still not ready," I said. But what I meant was, I don't know what ready even looks like anymore. Chris didn't touch me. He never had. But the space between us pulsed like something alive. "I'm not here to ruin your life," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to know I see you." That sentence. So simple. So dangerous. I see you. Michael hadn't said that in years. Not because he didn't care, but because he thought he already knew me. And maybe I'd stopped showing him anything worth seeing. Chris left before midnight. No kiss. No promise. Just a door that closed too gently for what I felt inside. The next morning, Michael was home early. He placed his suitcase in the hallway, stepped into the kitchen, and stared at me longer than usual. "How was your night?" he asked. I froze for a breath too long. "Quiet," I said. He nodded slowly, then turned to make coffee. As he poured the water, he spoke without looking up. "You know," he said, "I used to love the way you smiled when I walked into a room." I turned toward him, startled. He added, "Lately, you only smile like that for him." And there it was, the quiet truth that neither of us had wanted to say. I felt something break inside me. Not shatter, just crack. Just enough to let everything spill out. "I didn't mean for this," I whispered. Michael finally looked at me. His eyes weren't angry, just tired. None of us ever mean for it. But here we are. He left the kitchen, and I stood there, shaking, with a mug I hadn't realized I was still holding. Later that day, I opened an old drawer and found a letter Michael had written me years ago, on our 5th anniversary. It was tucked between bills and birthday cards. In it, he wrote, "Even if one day we forget how to say it, I hope we never forget how to show it." I sat on the floor and cried. Not for Chris. Not for guilt. But for everything we'd forgotten to show. The silence in the house became something I wore. It clung to my skin, filled every corner of the day. Michael wasn't cold. He was present, polite, careful. That was worse than distance. It was the echo of something once sacred now handled like fragile glass. I wanted to reach for him, to confess everything and beg for a reset. But how do you start again when you no longer remember where the beginning was?
Chris texted the next day.
"We should talk. One last time." I stared at the message for an hour before replying. "Tonight. No later than 9. When he arrived, I didn't invite him to sit. We stood in the kitchen just like the last time, but this time, something was different. The warmth was gone. There was only air between us now, and it was heavy with things that had no place left to land. He looked at me like he was memorizing me. "I'm not going to fight for you," he said softly. I nodded. "I'm not asking you to." "But I meant every word I said," he continued. "Every look. Every silence. I didn't come to destroy anything. I came because I still believe there's something real between us." I swallowed hard. "There is. But it's not enough." He nodded, slowly. "Is it him?" "No," I said. "It's me." There was a long pause. "Do you love him?" I closed my eyes.
Yes.
And no, not the way I used to. "Do you love me?" I didn't answer. Chris stepped closer, but not too close. "You don't have to say it. I want you to know I'm not waiting anymore. I can't." My voice broke. "I know." He didn't kiss me goodbye. He didn't touch me. He simply left. And this time I didn't watch him go. I sat on the floor of the kitchen after he left, hands clenched in my lap, breath shaking. I had made the choice. Not between two men, but between continuing to live in borrowed emotions or facing the wreckage of what I'd allowed myself to become. That night, I waited for Michael in the living room. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't pour wine. I just waited. When he came home, he paused in the doorway, sensing the difference. "I need to talk to you," I said. He sat down slowly. "Okay. I haven't been honest. With you. With myself. I let something happen or almost happen with Chris. Emotionally. And I knew it was wrong. I knew it when it started. But I didn't stop it. He didn't move. He didn't blink. I didn't cheat. But I wanted to. And that's almost worse." Michael looked away. His jaw clenched. When he finally spoke, his voice was like gravel. "I knew." I stared. "I've known for weeks," he continued. "I kept hoping it would pass. That it wasn't real. That maybe I was just being paranoid. But I knew. There it was. The hurt he hadn't shown. The betrayal that had been sitting silently in his eyes. "I'm so sorry," I said, my voice cracking. He nodded. "I believe you." We sat there, two people surrounded by years of shared life. Furniture we picked together. Curtains we argued over. The photo of our trip to Oregon where we laughed until we cried. All of it around us. And yet between us, something broken. "I don't know what to do now," I admitted. "Neither do I," he said. There was no yelling. No tears. Just a truth that neither of us could dress up anymore. That night, I didn't sleep in our bed. I lay on the couch, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like him, wondering when I stopped feeling worthy of his love, and when I stopped returning it. In the early morning hours, I whispered into the dark. "I miss who we were." But the dark had no answer. The morning after my confession, the house was quiet. Not tense. Not broken. Just still. Michael had already left for work. No note, no message. But he'd made coffee. My mug was beside the pot, steaming, waiting.
And I cried.
Because he still remembered how I took it. Because he still cared. Even now. I sat at the table for an hour, sipping it slowly, thinking of all the mornings we'd shared that routine, me reaching for sugar, him tying his tie, and how I'd taken the small, steady kindness for granted. How easy it is to forget what love looks like when it's quiet. Over the next days, we didn't talk much. We didn't argue, but we gave each other space. There were no decisions, no ultimatums. Just a slow untangling of what had once felt seamless. Chris never reached out again. No calls. No text. No message tucked under the door or sent in the middle of the night. At first, I hoped for closure, but what I got was silence. And maybe that was what I needed most. Because sometimes, the only way to move forward is to sit in the stillness long enough to feel the shape of your own heart again. I spent more time alone.
Walked. Wrote.
Sat in cafes by the window, journaling fragments of who I used to be and who I might still become. I remembered how I used to dream of becoming a poet. How I once promised myself I'd never lose my voice to anyone, not even love. And now here I was writing again. Not for validation. Not for escape.
But to hear myself think.
Michael and I didn't separate. Not officially. But something between us ended that week. And something else began, something more honest. We became two people who shared a history, a home, a grief. We weren't pretending anymore. One evening, we sat in the backyard, watching the sky turn orange. "I think I loved you best when you were still becoming," Michael said quietly. "And I think I forgot how to keep becoming," I replied. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The truth is, there's no neat resolution to stories like this. No cinematic ending. Just a woman sitting in the middle of her own brokenness, trying to build something honest out of the pieces. Chris was never the villain. Michael was never the fool. I was never the victim. We were just people, needing things, forgetting to ask for them, hoping someone would notice. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. But in the end, the question I had to answer wasn't, who do I love more? It was, when did I stop loving myself enough to notice I was disappearing?
And now?
I'm rebuilding. Not with someone else. Not to prove anything. Just slowly, day by day, with more truth than I had the courage to carry before. Sometimes I pass the mirror and catch my own eyes again. And I don't look away. Sometimes that's enough. And if you're still listening, still watching, maybe this story stirred something in you too. Maybe you've also stood at that quiet crossroad between what is safe and what is true. If you had to choose today, not between two people, but between silence and honesty, which would you choose? I'm not asking for answers. Just for you to be brave enough to ask the question. If this story touched something in you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Tales of Euphoria for more bittersweet truths. Your support means the world, and there's always another story waiting to be told.